Stop for a moment because what I'm about to say might explain everything you've been feeling lately. There is a shift happening in your life right now. Quiet, almost invisible, but powerful enough to change everything. You didn't argue. You didn't beg. You didn't even announce it. You simply stopped chasing, and in that single decision something deeper was triggered. The person who once felt so certain of your presence is now standing in unfamiliar silence. The energy you used to give so freely is gone, and now they can feel it not as noise but as absence. And absence has a strange powerment. It speaks directly to the parts of people they try to ignore. Right now, whether you see it or not, they are thinking, questioning, feeling something they didn't expect to feel, because for the first time they are experiencing you without your effort. And that changes everything. This is not about revenge. This is not about ego. This is about awareness. Welcome to Jung and Awareness Hub, where silence reveals truth and distance exposes what words never could. When you stop chasing someone, the shift that occurs is not loud or obvious at first, but it is deeply psychological. Before this moment, the connection was being sustained by your effort. Your messages, your attention, your emotional availability were constantly moving toward them, creating a kind of one-sided momentum. This momentum gave them a certain position of comfort where they didn't have to question much, didn't have to act decisively, and didn't have to fully face their own feelings. Meant they could simply exist within the connection without contributing equally because your energy was filling all the gaps. The moment you stop chasing, that entire structure collapses. Not because you created drama, but because you removed the force that was keeping things in motion. Meant what once felt stable to them now feels uncertain, and uncertainty is something the human mind is naturally uncomfortable with. When a pattern is broken, especially one that has been consistent, the brain immediately tries to understand why. This is where the shift in power quietly begins. Meant before their attention was passive. They received without needing to give. Now without your presence pushing toward them, their attention becomes active. They begin to notice the absence in ways they didn't notice the presentment. This is because people often become more aware of what is missing than what is consistently available. Your silence starts to carry weight, not because silence itself is powerful, but because it interrupts expectation. Meant they expected you to reach out, to show up, to continue as you always had. When that expectation is not met, it creates a psychological gapment. Inside that gap, questions begin to form. They may not even admit these questions consciously, but internally there is a shiftment. They start to replay interactions, analyze small details, and wonder if something has changed. This is not always about missing you immediately. It is about the disruption of certainty. Humans are deeply attached to patterns, especially emotional ones. When you remove your part in that pattern, it forces the other person into a position they were not prepared for. This is where the balance of emotional investment starts to equalize. Previously, you were investing more, and they were benefiting from that imbalance. Now, with your withdrawal, the imbalance becomes visible. They can no longer ignore it because they are no longer being carried by your effortment. The connection now requires something from them, and that requirement can feel unfamiliar or even uncomfortable. At a deeper level, this shift also touches the ego. When someone is used to being pursued, it reinforces a sense of control and validation. Your attention acted as a mirror reflecting their importance. When you stop chasing, that mirror is suddenly removed. This does not necessarily make them feel less valuable, but it makes them question the source of that validation. They may begin to wonder if they misjudged the situation, if they took something for granted, or if they are losing something they assumed would always be there. The absence of your pursuit also creates space for emotional clarity. When you were constantly present, your energy may have masked their true feelings. They didn't need to define how they felt because your actions were enough to maintain the connection. Now, without that external input, they are left alone with their internal state. This can lead to a realization of genuine feelings, or it can expose a lack of depth that was previously hidden. Another important aspect of this shift is that it removes pressure from you and transfers it to them. Before you were the one trying to make things happen, trying to move the connection forward, trying to get a response meant. Now that responsibility is no longer yours. The silence places them in a position where they must decide whether to step forward or remain still meant. This decision becomes more significant because it is no longer being influenced by your constant presence. What makes this shift so powerful is that it is not forced. You are not demanding attention, not asking for explanations, not creating emotional tension through confrontation. Instead, you are allowing the natural dynamics of the situation to reveal themselves. Without your effort sustaining the connection, what remains is the truth of how much the other person is willing to invest on their own. Silence has a way of doing what words often fail to accomplish. Meant when you step back and stop filling every gap with conversation, reassurance, or presence, you create a space that did not exist before. In that space, the other person is no longer being guided by your energyment. They are left alone with their own thoughts, and this is where reflection begins, whether they intend for it to or not. Before this silence, their experience of the connection was shaped largely by your actions. You reached out, you maintained contact, you made your interest known. Because of that, they didn't have to search within themselves for answersment. Your presence acted as a constant signal, something predictable and stable. But when that signal disappears, even quietly, the mind reacts. It notices the absence not as emptiness, but as something that needs to be understood. At first, the silence can feel confusing. They may check their phone more often than usual, not necessarily because they expect something specific, but because something feels off. The pattern they were used to has been interrupted. Human beings are deeply wired to recognize patterns, especially in relationships. When a pattern breaks, the brain begins to question why. This questioning is the beginning of reflection. As time passes, the silence becomes more noticeable. It is no longer just a brief pause. It starts to feel intentional, even if you never announced it as such. This perception matters because intention carries meaning. They may begin to wonder if they did something wrong, if something changed in you, or if the connection itself is fading. These thoughts are not always logical, but they are emotional responses to uncertainty. In this state, the mind begins to revisit the past. Small interactions that once seemed insignificant are re-examined. Conversations, tones, timing, even moments of hesitation are replayed internally. This is not because they suddenly became deeply analytical, but because the silence has removed distractions without new input from you. The only material available is what has already happened. Reflection feeds on memory, and memory becomes more vivid when it is all that remains. This process can bring out emotions that were previously suppressed or ignored. When everything was active and ongoing, there was no need to pause and feel deeply. The flow of interaction kept things moving, but silence slows everything down. It forces stillness, and in stillness, emotions rise more clearly. They may begin to feel a sense of loss, even if they cannot fully define what they are losing. They may feel curiosity, a need to understand what changed. In some cases, there may even be a subtle sense of regret, especially if they realize they did not fully appreciate your presence when it was consistent. Silence also removes external validation. When you were present, your attention may have reassured them consciously or unconsciously that everything was fine. Your messages, your effort, your consistency created a sense of security. Without that, they no longer have immediate confirmation of where they stand. This lack of validation pushes them inwardment. Instead of relying on you to define the connection, they must begin to define it for themselves. What makes silence particularly powerful is that it does not demand a response. There is no direct question to answer, no confrontation to react to. This absence of pressure can make the reflection more genuine. When people are confronted directly, they often respond defensively or impulsively, but silence gives them time. It allows their thoughts to develop without interference, which can lead to a more honest understanding of their own faint feelings. At the same time, silence can create discomfort. Not everyone is comfortable being alone with their thoughts, especially when those thoughts involve uncertainty or emotional ambiguity. Some may try to distract themselves, filling their time with other activities to avoid thinking too deeply. But even then, the awareness of the silence remains in the background. It does not disappear completely. It lingers, waiting to be acknowledged. This lingering effect is what keeps the reflection alive, and it is not a one-time realization but an ongoing process. Each moment without contact reinforces the idea that something has changed, and each reinforcement adds weight to their thoughts. Over time, this can lead to a clearer realization of what your presence meant to them, not because you explained it, but because they experienced its absence. In the end, silence becomes a mirrorment. It reflects back to them what was once hidden by constant interaction. Without your voice, they begin to hear their own more clearly. Without your presence, they begin to understand what that presence represented. Absence has a unique way of revealing emotional depth that constant presence often conceals. When someone is always there, available, responsive, consistent, the mind gradually normalizes that presence. It becomes part of the background rather than something consciously valued. This is not because the connection lacks meaning, but because familiarity reduces urgency. What is always available rarely feels at risk, and without a sense of risk, emotions tend to remain unexamined. When absence enters, that sense of certainty is disrupted. What was once predictable is no longer guaranteed. This change forces the mind to shift from passive acceptance to active awareness. The person who once moved through the connection without much thought now begins to notice what is no longer there. It is not just about missing messages or interactions. It is about the sudden recognition that something meaningful has been removed from their experience. This recognition does not always happen immediately. At first, absence can feel like a simple break in routine, but as time passes, the weight of it increases. The spaces where your presence once existed begin to feel more defined. Moments that were once shared or filled with interaction now feel quieter, and that quiet carries a different kind of awarenessment. It is in this awareness that emotions begin to surface more clearly. Presence often provides comfort, but it can also create a kind of emotional buffering. When someone knows you are there, they do not feel the need to fully process what you mean to them. Your availability acts as reassurance, allowing them to postpone deeper reflection. Absence removes that buffer. Without immediate access to you, they can no longer rely on interaction to maintain the connection. Instead, they must rely on their internal sense of what the connection represents. This internal shift is where depth begins to form. Feelings that were once vague or undefined start to take shapement. They may begin to recognize patterns they previously ignored, such as how often they thought about you, how they felt after conversations, or how your presence influenced their emotional state. These realizations are not created by absence itself, but absence makes them visible. It strips away distraction and leaves only what is genuinely felt. Another aspect of absence is that it introduces the possibility of loss. When someone is consistently present, the idea of losing them does not feel immediate or realment. But when they are no longer there in the same way, that possibility becomes more tangible. The mind begins to consider what it would mean if the absence were permanent. This consideration can intensify ye emotions not because something dramatic has happened, but because the value of what was there becomes clearer in its potential disappearance. This process also affects memory. In absence, the mind tends to revisit past experiences with greater focus. Moments that may have seemed ordinary at the time can take on new significance. The way you spoke, the way you showed up, the consistency you offered. These details become more noticeable when they are no longer being created in real time. Memory fills the gap left by absence, and in doing so, it often highlights the emotional impact of what was once present. Absence also removes the influence of immediate interaction, which can sometimes cloud perception. When people are actively engaging, their responses are often shaped by the moment, by mood, by circumstance, by distraction. But without ongoing interaction, those external influences fade, and what remains is a more stable internal understanding of how they feel. This can lead to a more honest assessment of the connection, one that is not dependent on temporary emotions or situational factors. In many cases, absence does not create new feelings, but reveals existing ones that were not fully acknowledged. It brings clarity by removing noise. What was once taken for granted becomes something to be reconsidered, and what was once unclear becomes more defined through the simple act of not being there anymore. When the pattern changes and you are no longer chasing, the other person often enters a state that is emotionally unsettled, meant even if they do not show it outwardly. The first reaction is rarely clear or direct. Instead, it tends to appear as a mix of confusion, curiosity, and a subtle form of anxiety. These responses do not always come all at once, but they gradually build as the absence of your usual behavior becomes more noticeable. Confusion is usually the starting G-point. They were accustomed to a certain rhythm, a predictable flow where you reached out, showed interest, and maintained the connection. That rhythm created a sense of stability even if they were not fully aware of it. When that stability disappears, the mind struggles to make sense of the changement. They may ask themselves simple but persistent questions. Why did the behavior shift? What caused it? And whether it reflects something they did or something that changed in you. This confusion is not just about the situation itself, but about the loss of clarity they once had. As confusion lingers, curiosity begins to grow. The human mind naturally seeks to resolve uncertainty, and curiosity becomes the mechanism for that search. They may start paying closer attention to small details, looking for signs or clues that explain your silence. This could involve checking your activity, recalling past conversations, or even interpreting things that previously seemed insignificant. Curiosity pulls their focus toward you in a way that did not exist before, because now there is something unknown that needs to be understood. Alongside curiosity, there is often a subtle rise in anxiety. This does not always appear as obvious worry, but more as an underlying tension. The absence of your attention removes a source of reassurance they may not have consciously recognized. When that reassurance is gone, the mind begins to consider possibilities that were previously ignored. They may start to wonder if they are losing your interest, if the connection is fading, or if they have been replaced. These thoughts can create a sense of unease even if they try to dismiss them. This anxiety is closely tied to the loss of control. When you were chasing, they had a certain level of influence over the dynamic. They could choose when to respond, how much effort to give, and how involved they want me to be, knowing that your presence would remain consistent. When you stop, that sense of control weakens. They can no longer predict your behavior in the same way, and unpredictability often leads to discomfort. The mind prefers situations it can anticipate, and your silence disrupts that preference. Another layer to this reaction is the impact on their self-perception. Your attention may have served as a form of validation, reinforcing their sense of importance within the connection. When that attention is no longer present, they may begin to question that sense of importance. This does not always lead to immediate insecurity, but it can create a subtle shift in how they view themselves in relation to you. They may start to wonder if they misread your feelings or if they overestimated their position in your life. At the same time, these emotional responses can lead to internal conflict. Part of them may want to reach out and resolve the uncertainty, while another part may hesitate due to pride, fear, or a desire to maintain their previous position. This conflict can intensify the feelings of confusion and anxiety because there is no clear direction for action. They are caught between wanting clarity and avoiding vulnerability, may push them to observe from a distance, trying to gather information without directly engaging. Anxiety may make them more sensitive to any sign that confirms their fears. Confusion keeps them questioning what changed and why. Together, these emotions create a state where they are more mentally and emotionally engaged with the situation than they were when everything was predictable. What makes this phase significant is that it shifts their role from passive to active, at least internally. They are no longer simply receiving your attention. They are processing, questioning, and feeling the impact of its absence. Even if they do not act immediately, their internal state is no longer neutral. It has been activated by the change in your behavior, and that activation can influence what they choose to do next. whether that leads them closer or causes them to withdraw further into themselves. When your energy is no longer constantly directed toward them, something subtle but important happens. They are left without the external force that once shaped their experience of the connectionment. Before, your attention, effort, and emotional presence acted almost like a guide. It kept things moving, filled in gaps, and often made it easier for them to stay in a passive enrollment. They didn't need to question themselves deeply, because your actions were already answering everything on the surface. Once that energy is removed, they are no longer being carried by your consistency. The connection, instead of being sustained by you, becomes something they have to face on their own terms. This is where confrontation begins, not in a dramatic or confrontational sense, but internally. They are left alone with their own thoughts, reactions, and emotional patterns without your presence softening or distracting from them. At first, this can feel unfamiliar. When someone is used to receiving attention without needing to reciprocate equally, they become comfortable in that imbalance. Your effort may have allowed them to avoid making clear decisions about how they feel. They could stay in a space of ambiguity, neither fully committing nor fully letting go. But without your energy maintaining that space, ambiguity becomes harder to sustainment. They begin to notice their own behavior more clearly. How often did they initiate? How much effort did they truly invest? These questions may not come in direct words, but they appear as a quiet awareness. The absence of your presence acts like a mirror reflecting their level of involvement. Vent back to them. This reflection can be uncomfortable, especially if it reveals a gap between what they felt and how they acted. At a deeper level, they are forced to confront their emotional truth. When you were present, your energy may have influenced how they felt in the moment. Your attention could create warmth, connection, or even attachment. But those feelings were partially sustained by your actions. Without that external input, they must rely on what remains internally. This is where clarity begins to form. If their feelings were genuine and deeper than they realized, your absence can bring that to the surface. They may begin to feel a stronger sense of missing you, not just as a habit, but as a person. They may recognize the emotional impact you had on their life in a way they didn't fully understand before. This realization does not come from you telling them, but from them experiencing the difference between having you there and not having you there. On the other hand, if their feelings were shallow or dependent on your effort, that truth also becomes clear. Without your energy to sustain the connection, the emotional intensity may fade rather than grow. This can be a difficult realization because it forces them to see that what they experienced was not as deep as they may have believed. In this way, your absence does not create new feelings. It exposes what was already there. Another important aspect of this process is that it removes distraction. When you were actively engaging, their focus was partly on responding, interacting, and maintaining the flow. Now, without that ongoing interaction, there is more mental space. That space can no longer be filled by your presence, so it is filled by their own thoughts. These thoughts tend to return to the same question in different forms. What does this connection actually mean to me? This question can be difficult to answer because it requires honesty. There is no immediate response from you to influence their thinking, no reassurance to avoid the deeper issuement. They are left with themselves, and that can lead to a more genuine understanding of their emotions, even if that understanding takes time to fully emerge. At the same time, this confrontation is not always comfortable. Some people resist it. They may try to distract themselves, avoid thinking too deeply, or minimize the importance of the connection to protect themselves from emotional discomfort. But even in avoidance, the awareness remains. The absence you created continues to exist, and with it, the quiet pressure to acknowledge what they truly feel and who they are within the connection. What happens next is not determined by the situation alone, but by the inner structure of the person facing it. When your absence creates space, that space demands a response. But the nature of that response depends entirely on their level of emotional maturity. This is where the difference between reaction and awareness becomes clear. A person with emotional maturity does not simply react to discomfort. They try to understand it. When they feel the shift caused by your absence, they don't immediately escape it or ignore it. Instead, they begin to look inward. They recognize that something has changed. And rather than blaming the situation or creating assumptions, they become curious about their own feelings. This curiosity is not surface level. It leads them to question their past behavior, their lack of action, and the role they played in the dynamic. They start to see patterns they may have overlooked before. They may realize that they relied too much on your effort, or that they avoided making clear choices when they had the chance. Mint. This awareness can bring a sense of responsibility. I meant instead of focusing on what they lost, they begin to understand what they did or didn't contribute. This shift is important because it moves them from a passive role into an active ownement. From this place, their actions tend to be intentional. If they value the connection, they will move toward it with more clarity. They won't reach out impulsively just to fill the silence. They will reach out with purpose. Their communication may feel different, more direct, more honest, and less dependent on you carrying the interaction. This does not mean everything suddenly becomes perfect, but it shows a willingness to engage in a more balanced way. On the other hand, a person who lacks emotional maturity responds differently. The same absence that creates reflection in one person can create avoidance in another. Instead of looking inward, they look for ways to escape the discomfort. They may distract themselves, shift their attention elsewhere, or convince themselves that the situation does not matter. This is not because they feel nothing, but because facing their emotions feels overwhelming or unfamiliar. In some cases, they may interpret your absence as rejection and respond defensively. Rather than asking what changed, they may assume negative conclusions and protect themselves by withdrawing further. This creates a cycle where distance leads to more distance, not because the connection had no value, but because they are not equipped to handle the vulnerability required to address it. There is also a tendency in less mature responses to focus on control rather than understanding. They may wait for you to return to your previous behavior, hoping the dynamic will reset without them having to change. Mint. This waiting is not passive in a calm sense. It is rooted in resistance. Mint. They resist the idea that they need to take initiative or confront their own role, so they remain where they are even if it means losing the connection entirely. What becomes clear through this process is that your absence acts as a kind of test. Not one you design deliberately, but one that naturally emerges from the situation. It reveals whether the other person is capable of growth or whether they remain tied to their previous patterns. In the end, nothing truly changed except your energyment. You stopped chasing, and in doing so, you allowed the truth to surface. What was once hidden behind effort, consistency, and presence is now visible in its pure form. Their reaction, their silence, or their action, whatever comes next, is not something you control, and it was never meant to be. It is simply a reflection of who they are when they are no longer being carried by you. Some will rise to meet the moment, stepping forward with clarity and intention. Others will remain where they are, unable to move beyond their own limits. But in both cases, the outcome serves the same purpose. It reveals what is real and what is not. You are no longer chasing an answer because the answer is now unfolding on its ownment. And that is where your power truly lies. Not in pursuing, not in convincing, but in allowing. Allowing people to show you who they are meant, allowing space to bring clarity, allowing yourself to move forward without needing to force anything into place. Because what is meant to meet you will move toward you, and what is not will quietly fall away. Good luck on your journey. May you, Awa and Eyes, choose your peace over confusion and your self-worth over uncertainty. Thank you for listening, for being here, and for allowing these words to resonate with